Major Camille Harris had just wrapped up a grueling day of meetings, her mind still focused on the complex international negotiations she had been overseeing. As the Chief of Global Affairs for the U.S. Army, her responsibilities extended far beyond the walls of any one office. She was a key figure in shaping military strategy and diplomacy around the world. But tonight, as she drove her black sedan through the quiet suburban streets, she wasn't thinking about global security or high-stakes discussions. She was simply looking forward to getting home, putting her feet up, and enjoying a few hours of peace before starting the cycle all over again. The evening air was crisp, and the headlights of her car illuminated the empty road ahead. Her phone buzzed in the passenger seat, a reminder of an ongoing project. Camille glanced at the screen, but decided to leave it unanswered. It could wait. As she approached the intersection near her neighborhood, she noticed a police car parked at the corner, its lights dim but still visible from the rearview mirror. She didn't think much of it until she saw the flash of headlights behind her. A moment later, the police siren blared to life, piercing the quiet night. Camille's heart skipped a beat, though her exterior remained composed. She wasn't nervous. She knew she hadn't been speeding. There were no other cars on the road, and she had been following the speed limit precisely. Nevertheless, she pulled over to the side, flicking on her hazard lights, and waited for the officer to approach. The officer was a tall, middle-aged man with graying hair and a stern expression. He walked to her window and leaned down, not bothering with pleasantries. "Good evening, ma'am. Do you know why I pulled you over?" he asked, his voice firm. "I'm not sure," Camille replied calmly, rolling down the window just enough to speak. "I haven't been speeding, and there's no one else on the road. Was I doing something wrong?" The officer's eyes narrowed slightly, but his tone didn't soften. "You were going over the speed limit back there," he said, pointing behind her to a section of the road she had just passed. "I clocked you at 10 miles over the limit." Camille felt a twinge of confusion. She had been driving carefully, and she was certain she hadn't been speeding. "I don't believe I was speeding, officer. Are you sure about the reading?" The officer paused for a moment, clearly deciding whether to entertain her challenge. "Unsure. I'll be issuing you a citation for the violation." He reached for his notebook, scribbling down the details. "May I see the radar reading?" she asked politely. The officer's gaze tightened, as if the request had caught him off guard. "No need," he replied curtly. "I've already made my decision." Camille suppressed a sigh. Her instincts told her this wasn't just a case of a simple misunderstanding. There was something more at play here, something that made her feel as if she were being judged before the facts were even considered. But she didn't push the issue further. Instead, she handed over her license and registration, knowing the matter would be settled later. As the officer walked back to his patrol car to process the ticket, Camille stared ahead, her thoughts racing. What had started as an ordinary drive home had suddenly turned into an encounter she hadn't anticipated. Little did she know, the events that would follow this moment would unravel in ways that no one, especially Judge Thomas Weaver, could have predicted. Several weeks had passed since the traffic stop, and Major Camille Harris stood at the entrance of a small local courthouse. The air inside the building was cool and smelled faintly of old wood and polished floors, a stark contrast to the brisk warmth of the outside world. It was an ordinary morning, but Camille's heart raced as she entered the courtroom to contest the ticket issued to her by Officer Randall. She had expected the situation to be resolved quickly, but the experience had left her with more questions than answers. Questions about why she had been targeted in the first place, and why the officer seemed so determined to dismiss her without listening. As she walked up the aisle to the front of the courtroom, the quiet hum of murmured conversations suddenly quieted. The usual local crowd of residents, here for their own minor violations, looked up in curiosity. Camille, tall and composed in a dark suit, didn't seem to blend in with the typical defendants who filled the room. Her presence commanded attention, even though she was here for what should have been a simple matter: contesting a speeding ticket. Judge Thomas Weaver, an older man in his mid-60s with a white beard and glasses perched on his nose, presided over the case. His reputation in town was one of no-nonsense rulings, and his word in the courtroom was final. He glanced down at the paperwork in front of him without so much as a greeting. Major Camille Harris, the judge read aloud, his voice raspy from years of experience. He barely looked up. I see you're here to contest a traffic ticket issued by Officer Randall. What is your defense? Camille, standing with confidence, addressed the judge. Your Honor, I was not speeding. I maintain that I was within the speed limit, and I respectfully ask for the citation to be dismissed. The judge didn't appear particularly interested. I see, he muttered. He glanced at the ticket, flipping it over, as if already convinced of its legitimacy. Officer Randall's radar clocked you well above the limit. He's been an officer in this town for over 15 years. I'm inclined to believe his judgment over your claims. Camille's eyebrows raised slightly, her composure unshaken. With all due respect, Your Honor, I'm confident the officer misread the speed. I have a clean driving record, and I've followed the law. I don't believe this citation was warranted. The judge's eyes flickered briefly as he set the ticket down on the desk, still not fully engaging with her words. It's a simple matter, he said, his tone dismissive. You say you weren't speeding, but Officer Randall says you were. He's the expert, not you. Camille took a deep breath, resisting the urge to point out that her own expertise in military affairs had taught her how to approach complex situations logically without making assumptions. She knew this wasn't just about the ticket anymore. It was about the preconceived judgments being made based on her appearance alone, something she would soon make clear. The room grew tense as the judge's indifference and the prosecutor's agreement seemed to weigh heavily on the outcome. The other defendants, waiting for their turn, cast sidelong glances toward Camille. It was clear they were watching closely, not just for the result of her case, but for how she would respond in a place that seemed far more concerned with routine than fairness. Camille stood her ground, silently preparing for the unexpected turn she knew was coming. What started as a simple dispute over a speeding ticket would soon reveal far more than anyone could have anticipated. The tension in the courtroom thickened as Judge Thomas Weaver shuffled papers in front of him, clearly eager to get through the day's docket. His eyes remained fixed on the ticket, his judgment already made. Camille stood tall, the weight of the room bearing down on her, but she refused to falter. The proceedings were moving faster than she anticipated, and with every word the judge uttered, it became clear this wasn't just about the speeding violation. It was about a deeper issue. Your Honor, Camille began, trying to keep her voice steady despite the undercurrent of frustration rising within her. I'm asking you to reconsider the facts. The radar reading could have been inaccurate. I've been driving for over 20 years, and I'm certain I wasn't speeding. Judge Weaver, not looking up, muttered, Well, if you're so certain, I'll take that into account, but I'll remind you that Officer Randall is a trained professional. He's clocked hundreds of drivers. His word carries more weight than yours, I'm afraid. The prosecutor, a young man named Alex Harper, who had been sitting quietly at the table, now leaned forward. I agree with the judge, Miss Harris. Officer Randall's equipment and training have been verified multiple times. It's hard to believe that someone with such a spotless record like his would make a mistake. Camille's pulse quickened. The casual dismissal of her testimony was a familiar feeling, one she had encountered more times than she cared to admit throughout her career. She had navigated complex diplomatic negotiations, worked alongside foreign leaders, and even advised generals in life-or-death situations. But in this small courtroom, no one seemed to care about her credentials or expertise. The presumption of guilt based on her appearance was palpable, and it was becoming painfully clear that this wasn't just about the ticket. I'm not questioning Officer Randall's experience, Camille responded, her voice calm but firm. But I am asking for fairness. I know the road I was driving on, and I know I wasn't speeding. This ticket is a mistake. The judge glanced up finally, his eyes narrowing, as if Camille's words were an inconvenience. "Mistakes happen, Ms. Harris," he said dismissively. "But it's your word against a seasoned officer's. I'm inclined to side with the one who has the proven track record." Her frustration surged, but Camille took another deep breath. This wasn't just about her. It wasn't even about the ticket anymore. This was about how quickly people could jump to conclusions, how easily someone like her, someone dressed in professional clothes, appearing unremarkable in this small-town courtroom, could be dismissed as just another defendant. She knew the biases she was facing, and the judgment she was receiving wasn't rooted in the facts of the case. The prosecutor leaned forward again, his tone almost casual as he added, "There's really no reason to challenge the officer's decision. If you were really in the right, you wouldn't be wasting the court's time." A ripple of discomfort spread through the room. The statement seemed so routine, so rehearsed, and yet Camille felt the weight of each word, each subtle assumption that she didn't belong in this space, that her word wasn't enough. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, marking the passage of time, and with every second, Camille grew more aware of the systemic forces at play. The assumptions, the biases, and the underlying prejudice that made this courtroom feel like an arena where some people simply didn't matter. And yet, she was ready. She wouldn't back down. Not this time. Just as Judge Weaver was about to speak, the heavy courtroom door swung open with an abrupt creak. The sound cut through the tense silence like a knife. Everyone in the room turned their attention to the new arrival. A tall man in a sharp military uniform, his posture straight, his presence commanding. He wasn't a local. The polished brass on his jacket gleamed under the courtroom's fluorescent lights, signaling he was no ordinary officer. Camille recognized him immediately. Lieutenant Colonel Evan Turner, a close colleague of hers from the Army's Global Affairs Division. He had been instrumental in the negotiations she had led just weeks before, and she had no doubt he was here for one reason: to set the record straight. The room, once filled with the low hum of disinterest, fell into an immediate, almost uncomfortable silence. The young prosecutor, Harper, quickly straightened in his seat, glancing at the judge as though uncertain of what was happening. Judge Weaver's eyes widened, and his hand froze midair, the gavel still in his grasp. "Major Harris," Lieutenant Colonel Turner said, his voice deep and authoritative. "I believe there's been a misunderstanding here." Camille stood a little straighter, though her gaze never wavered from the judge. Turner turned to face the courtroom, his eyes scanning the room, as if assessing the situation. "I'm here to confirm that Major Harris is not just any civilian. She is the chief of the Army's Global Affairs Division. She's responsible for coordinating military operations and diplomatic efforts across the globe. She oversees the Army's international relations and advises the highest-ranking officials in the Department of Defense." There was a collective gasp from the small crowd of onlookers, their heads swiveling back and forth, unsure of how to process this new information. Judge Weaver blinked, his lips parting slightly, clearly thrown off balance by the unexpected revelation. For a moment, everything seemed suspended in time. The judge, who had dismissed Camille's words so easily just moments ago, now looked at her with an entirely new gaze, one that wasn't tinted with the same casual dismissal. The shift was almost palpable. "Chief of Global Affairs," Judge Weaver repeated slowly, his voice now tinged with uncertainty. "Yes, Your Honor," Turner replied with a crisp nod. "Major Harris is a senior leader within the U.S. Army. She advises generals and government officials, makes decisions that affect military strategy across the globe, and plays a pivotal role in maintaining international peace. Her expertise extends far beyond what most people could ever imagine." The prosecutor, still caught off guard, stammered, But the officer's radar rating." Lieutenant Colonel Turner raised a hand, cutting him off. "The issue here isn't the radar reading, Mr. Harper. The issue is that Major Harris has been treated like any other ordinary citizen, when in fact, she is anything but. It's important for the court to consider her position, not as a matter of prestige, but as a recognition of the level of responsibility and judgment she carries. I don't believe she's the type to break the law over a minor infraction. The words hung in the air, and for the first time since the case began, Camille could see the cracks in the judge's unflappable demeanor. The courtroom felt suddenly smaller, as if the revelation had made everyone reconsider their initial assumptions. Judge Weaver cleared his throat, the authority in his voice faltering slightly. I see. I didn't realize the full scope of your role, Major Harris." He paused, glancing at the prosecutor, who seemed unsure of how to proceed. "This changes things." Camille didn't move, didn't react to the judge's acknowledgement. She knew that this wasn't a victory yet. It was only the first step toward addressing something far bigger than a speeding ticket. What had begun as an ordinary case had now become a reminder of how easily assumptions and biases could skew the truth, and how important it was for people to stand firm in the face of them. But as the room settled into an uncomfortable quiet, Camille could feel the weight of the moment. The battle ahead wouldn't be won in the courtroom. It would be won by making sure the assumptions didn't happen in the first place. The room was still, the revelation hanging in the air like a cloud that refused to dissipate. Judge Weaver's confusion was palpable, his eyes scanning the paperwork in front of him again, as if he might somehow find a different explanation. Lieutenant Colonel Turner's words had shifted the entire atmosphere in the courtroom, and for the first time, Camille saw the judge not as an authority figure, but as a man confronted with his own assumptions. She knew, in that moment, that this wasn't just about getting the ticket dismissed. It was about dismantling the subtle biases that people like her faced every day. The silence stretched on until the judge cleared his throat, a weak attempt to regain control over the proceedings. "I wasn't aware of the full scope of your role, Major Harris. This changes things," he repeated, but his tone had lost much of its earlier confidence. His attempt to sound authoritative fell flat, as if the very foundations of his decision-making were now shaking beneath him. Camille didn't flinch. Her gaze remained steady, unwavering. She had worked too hard and fought too long to be treated as anyone less than what she was. As a woman who had risen through the ranks of the military, navigating a world that often overlooked people like her, she had come to understand that sometimes you had to make others confront their own biases head-on. "Your Honor," Camille began, her voice calm but firm, "I didn't come here to be treated differently because of my position. I came here because I believe in fairness. I came here because I'm a law-abiding citizen who happens to be the Chief of Global Affairs for the U.S. Army." Judge Weaver nodded, but there was an air of discomfort about him now, as if his world had been upended. I understand, Major Harris. It was a mistake to assume your background didn't matter in this case." The prosecutor, Alex Harper, shuffled his papers awkwardly, his earlier certainty now replaced with uncertainty. He glanced at the judge, then back at Camille. I understand your position, Major Harris, but Officer Randall's radar reading was still valid, and the law is the law." Camille didn't give him a chance to finish. She raised her hand slightly, signaling that she was ready to address this, not just for her own case, but for the larger issue at hand. "Officer Randall may have had valid equipment," she said, her tone growing sharper now, "but the law is meant to be applied fairly, not through assumptions and biases. I'm not here to argue that the officer wasn't doing his job, but to remind you that everyone, regardless of their background or status, deserves a fair chance." Her words landed heavily in the room. The air was thick with the weight of what she was saying, something that went beyond the facts of her case and reached deep into the core of justice itself. Judge Weaver, though still uncomfortable, appeared to be listening now, his earlier dismissiveness gone. "I believe I may have overstepped in my previous remarks, Major Harris," he said quietly, his tone more measured than before. "I apologize." Camille nodded, accepting his apology, but not fully satisfied. The apology was a step in the right direction, but she knew this wasn't enough. This moment wasn't just about her. It was about what this courtroom, this town, could learn from the encounter. "I appreciate the apology, Your Honor," she said, her voice steady. But this moment needs to serve as a reminder that bias, whether conscious or unconscious, can affect outcomes. It's something we all need to be aware of, especially when it comes to those in positions of power. The judge seemed to pause, taking in her words. For the first time, he seemed genuinely reflective, as if Camille's message had finally pierced through the layers of routine that had clouded his judgment. Camille stood tall, waiting for the next steps, knowing that while the court's decision was still pending, the true victory had already begun. The process of change, of understanding, had already taken root in the room. And that, she realized, was more important than any fine or ticket. The courtroom was uncomfortably quiet as Camille's words lingered in the air. The weight of the moment pressed down on everyone, on the judge, the prosecutor, and the rest of the people in the room. It wasn't just about the speeding ticket anymore. It was about something much larger, something systemic. The assumptions, biases, and preconceived notions that shaped how people were treated, even in places where justice was supposed to be blind. Judge Weaver, still holding his gavel loosely in his hand, seemed to be struggling with the reality that had been presented to him. Camille had disrupted the routine of his courtroom, forcing him to confront a truth he had never considered in such stark terms. He shifted in his chair, clearing his throat as if trying to regain control, but the truth had already settled in. His earlier confidence was gone, replaced by a palpable unease. I'll admit I was wrong in my initial approach," Judge Weaver said, his voice less authoritative than before. He looked at Camille, his gaze now more thoughtful, though still tinged with a sense of discomfort. "I made assumptions based on appearances. I didn't fully grasp the extent of your role and the level of responsibility you carry. I apologize for that." Camille nodded, her expression neutral. She appreciated the apology, but it wasn't enough. This wasn't about a simple mistake. It was about understanding the deeper implications of the biases that existed, even in places that were supposed to be impartial. "I understand your apology, Your Honor," she said, her voice measured. "But this moment is about more than acknowledging a mistake. It's about recognizing how easily people can be judged, and how quickly those judgments can shape the course of their lives." The prosecutor, Alex Harper, looked like he was trying to regain his footing after the unexpected turn of events. His earlier certainty had been replaced by hesitation, and his attempts to interject now seemed strained. I understand your perspective, Major Harris," he began, but there was a lack of conviction in his voice. "But the law is the law. Officer Randall's radar reading still stands, doesn't it?" Camille's gaze shifted toward the prosecutor, but her tone remained calm and resolute. "The law is supposed to serve justice, but justice can't be served when assumptions are made without facts, when individuals are judged based on stereotypes or outward appearances. It's not just about following the law. It's about ensuring the law works for everyone, regardless of who they are or where they come from." The room was silent. For the first time, people were considering her words, reflecting on the broader implications of their actions. Judge Weaver looked down at the ticket, his fingers hovering above the papers as if uncertain how to proceed. The moment felt suspended in time, an uncomfortable yet necessary pause. "I will consider what you've said," the judge finally replied, his voice more thoughtful now, his previous confidence gone. "This case is not just about a citation. It's about fairness and equity. And I will take that into account when making my decision." Camille, standing tall and composed, didn't respond immediately. She had said what needed to be said. The fight for fairness wasn't won with a single conversation or in a single courtroom. But for the first time, it seemed that the judge was beginning to grasp the magnitude of the issue. And that, in itself, was a small victory. As the courtroom settled into a quieter rhythm, Camille felt a sense of resolve. She hadn't come here for an apology, nor was she interested in public recognition, but she understood that her role, her position, meant that when she spoke, people listened. And perhaps, just maybe, this small act of speaking up would begin to chip away at the walls of bias that had so long shaped people's understanding of fairness. The shift, though subtle, had begun. And with that, she knew, the fight for true equality was far from over. But at least it had started in the most unexpected of places. The courtroom remained unusually still as the judge leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping lightly against the gavel. Camille's words hung in the air like an unresolved chord, one that demanded reflection, and perhaps action. Despite the previous tension, there was now a sense of anticipation. The usual hum of daily cases had evaporated, replaced by the weight of what had transpired. The small crowd, some local residents, others just here for their own cases, watched closely. Many had been caught off guard by the appearance of Lieutenant Colonel Turner and by Camille's calm yet powerful response to what seemed like a simple traffic ticket. The room had changed, and so had the tone of the case. Camille knew she wasn't just fighting for the dismissal of a ticket anymore. She had, whether by design or by circumstance, shifted the conversation into something deeper, the role of fairness in the legal process, and how easy it was for assumptions to cloud judgment. Judge Weaver, now visibly more contemplative, glanced down at the ticket once again, his earlier dismissiveness replaced by a more careful examination. He was no longer the judge who had barely acknowledged Camille's position. He was a man confronted with a reality he hadn't fully considered, a man now tasked with making a decision that carried more weight than it had when the case first began. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the judge spoke. "Major Camille Harris, I've heard your arguments, and I've considered your position, as well as the officer's testimony. I will admit that I approached this case with certain assumptions, and I regret that." He looked directly at Camille, his voice softer than before, as if trying to rebuild the trust that had been lost. "It's clear to me now that your background and your experience should not have been dismissed. This case should not have been about bias, and I sincerely apologize for not recognizing that sooner." Camille met his gaze, her expression neutral. She didn't seek an apology. What she sought was fairness, something much bigger than just this single case. And perhaps, just perhaps, the judge was beginning to understand that. However, Judge Weaver continued, "The issue of whether or not you were speeding remains. Officer Randall's radar clocked you at over the limit, and I must still consider the technical aspects of the case." He paused, glancing at the ticket one last time. "I've also taken into account the way this case has unfolded, and I can see that it has brought important matters to the surface." A few moments of tense silence followed. The air felt charged, as if the entire courtroom was holding its breath, waiting for the final verdict. "I'm dismissing the citation," Judge Weaver said at last, his voice firm. "Not because you are Major Harris, or because of your position, but because the circumstances surrounding this case, along with the broader conversation it has sparked, deserve a different conclusion." The room was silent for a beat, then murmurs of disbelief and relief spread among the onlookers. Camille, though, didn't show any outward reaction. She had fought for something bigger than a mere legal victory. She had fought to make people see beyond the surface, to think critically about their judgments, and to ensure that bias, whether intentional or not, had no place in the system. Her eyes briefly met Lieutenant Colonel Turner's across the room. He gave her a nod, an unspoken acknowledgement that the battle had been won, not just in the courtroom, but in the minds of everyone who had witnessed this shift. As the judge wrapped up the case, Camille gathered her things, her posture as confident as ever. She knew that the road ahead would be long, and that the fight for true equality and fairness would require more than one courtroom victory. But today, in this small-town courthouse, a small but significant change had taken place, and Camille Harris, Chief of the Army's Global Affairs, had played a pivotal role in making it happen. As Major Camille Harris walked out of the courtroom, she couldn't help but feel a sense of quiet satisfaction. The ticket had been dismissed, but that wasn't the true victory. The real win was the shift in perspective she had sparked, not just in Judge Weaver, but in everyone who had witnessed the exchange. The people who had watched her stand her ground, who had heard her call for fairness and an end to assumptions, would carry that lesson with them. That, Camille knew, was where the real change began. Outside, the crisp air greeted her like an old friend. The courthouse steps seemed less imposing now, the weight of the decision behind her. She was ready to move on, to return to her work in global affairs, to the challenges of international diplomacy and military strategy. But a part of her would always carry this moment with her, the moment she stood up not just for herself, but for something larger. Lieutenant Colonel Turner, who had been waiting for her outside the courtroom, offered her a nod of respect as she approached. "You handled that with grace," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of his experience. "Not many could have turned that situation around the way you did." Camille smiled faintly, her eyes scanning the street ahead. "Sometimes it's not about handling things with grace," she replied. "It's about knowing when to stand your ground and not let others make assumptions about who you are or what you stand for." Turner's expression softened. "You're right. You didn't just challenge the ticket. You challenged a system that too often ignores the humanity behind the uniform." Camille nodded, appreciating his words. But she wasn't thinking about her uniform, her position, or the attention that had followed her into the courtroom. What mattered most was that people, real people, not just figures on a case file, had the ability to change the narrative. As they walked to their cars, Camille glanced at her phone, noticing a few messages waiting for her. She'd need to return to her global responsibilities soon. There were countless meetings, strategies, and diplomatic talks ahead. But today, her thoughts were still with the courtroom. She couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. For all the barriers she had broken in her military career, the fight for equality and understanding went far beyond her own experiences. It would take more than one conversation, more than one courtroom to make a lasting difference. But she was ready for it. The battle for fairness, Camille knew, was ongoing. But as the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the streets, she felt an unshakable conviction that things could and would change, one decision at a time. It wouldn't happen overnight, but every step, no matter how small, mattered. And today, she had taken one of those steps.